am surprised with the popularity of 14 and how many people are playing 14 that people aren't even giving 11 a shot. That is the part that surprised me, where like people will have played every Final Fantasy game, including, 14, 16, like everything, all the mainline ones. Like, yeah, haven't played 11, won't ever play it.
Final Fantasy Union in particular, I remember this. They did a video about all of the things that Final Fantasy was doing, I think in the year of 2023. That was a huge year for Final Fantasy XI. Again, Prime weapons were kind of a big buzz. The Voracious Resurgence was finally having its finale. Final Fantasy Union said, yeah, they're having a discount, and that's all they said about 11 in 2023.
So for me, when I consider like what is main story and what is expansion, my criteria is generally the list on the side of the screen when you boot up Final Fantasy XI. There's different degrees of what Final Fantasy XI fans consider to be, canon and main story content. So some folks will say like everything is main story because it's an MMO. The main story can be whatever you want it to be, which is kind of a useless like starting point. I don't really engage with that too much. Then you've got the next level of fans who say only things that like were traditional expansion packs count. So it had to have like a physical release. Square had to label it as expansion pack. If it's labeled as anything else, it's not a real expansion. So Chains of Pamathia, Treasure of Otagon, Seekers of Adulan, Rise of the Zarlight, those are all traditional expansion packs. Those are, what some fans consider count as main story. And then they would say Rhapsodies doesn't count because it's not an expansion pack, even though it leads to end credits. So there's that camp, and the camp that I go with is, what does Square elevate as main story content? What is sort of the general consensus? And I look at the side of the screen list. If they're going to put Chains of Pamathia and Amugo Coup d'Etat on the same list with like giving a logo, a fancy intro, everything, treating it like main story, I think it counts because those were separate paid for releases. So because it didn't have a physical release, that means it doesn't count. I think it's a very like esoteric and not very useful criteria in that regard. So for me, the stuff on the side of the screen counts. So all of that, those were all separate paid for releases, which, you get in the bundle nowadays. But at the time, like, if you wanted a Moogle Coup d'Etat, you had to pay for it separately, in the same way you'd pay for an expansion pack separately. So the only difference is that it was less content, it was cheaper, and it wasn't a physical release, but it was still, like, a separate paid for expansion to the game. So that's where all that counts, and Abyssia. And then, because Rhapsodies leads into end credits, and offered so many new gameplay additions and required like all of the other expansions to play, that counts. And most fans count Rhapsodies. Like, there are some who just like, oh, it's not a real expansion, but like, keeping it real, most fans think Rhapsodies is pretty good and count it. And then Voracious requires being Rhapsodies, so like you get it only after you've beaten Rhapsodies. It has its own soundtrack. It's been on the Square, Final Fantasy XI website for years as like the big banner, like prime content. They treat it like an expansion in terms of like how much they promote it. It's like the big thing on the site for like 3 years. It's got its own Battlefield content, which a lot of expansions are defined by having, side quests and Battlefield content, which it does. It has new gear, one new location. It's tiny, and it's basically just a place to go get the new gear, but still it's a new location. So I think all of that combined makes Voracious count. I mean, once again, it has its own soundtrack and Battlefield content, and it's longer than Rhapsodies. So if Rhapsodies counts, I don't see why Voracious wouldn't count.
That makes sense, yeah. I like that a lot. When I first started playing, I was told by a lot of people that there was no main story. I found out about Rhapsodies, and I thought, well, Rhapsodies seems to be tying a lot together. So, literally, when I started my series, my criteria for main story was if Rhapsodies requires it, then it's main story. If it's not, then it's, just a collection of stories. I really do like that criteria, though. And that's also one thing. For me personally, I don't really think it's all that important what constitutes main story. It's all Final Fantasy, I think both of us agree the story for, say, Dynamis is not nearly as good as the story of Chains of Pamathia. That having been said, I did want you to kind of elaborate on that, because I kind of want some people to see, all because we have mild disagreements on this topic, I mean, we're still talking about the same Final Fantasy XI. It's not that important of an issue unless you just start disregarding content, if you know what I mean. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I was having a debate in the comment section with someone who said I was completely wrong about Final Fantasy XI and its story, but also acknowledged they skipped the cutscenes. So that was a wild, fun time. But for me,
Yeah, it's
oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just about to say, to me, it's really, really crazy that a lot of people who completely skip all of Final Fantasy XI's, all of its story content, have really, really strong opinions about the proper way to enjoy the game. I'm not saying they enjoy the game improperly. That having been said, it's perfectly fine to enjoy the gameplay of the game or the story of the game. There are a lot of facets. It's strange to me to encounter someone who's really dogmatic when they meet someone else who enjoys the game very differently, you know?
I mean, I'm a bit dogmatic on the other side, probably as a bit of a counter to that, because I feel like, the entire Abyssia thing, we're just like, there's new gear and the level cap increased. Yeah, every time I've debated someone about, like, post-Abyssia content ruining the game, I always remind them everything they liked about pre-Abyssia is still in the game, it's still in the code, none of it has been removed. If you want to spend a year hanging out with, like, 20 people trying to grind for one helmet, nothing's stopping you from doing that, or you can just get really good gear faster in a month. But nothing is stopping you from playing that way. Chain attacks are still in there. You can still do gear swapping. All those options are still in the game. It's just they added quality of life features and the ability to make it less grindy for those who choose not to be. And the challenge I always pose to the private server people who say the game was better pre-Abyss is like, name me one thing exclusive to the private servers that Final Fantasy XI retail doesn't have mechanically. And the answer is there's nothing. Everything mechanically from pre-Abyssia is still in the game. You can engage with the mechanics in that way if you choose to, but there's options for people who don't want to do that. And that is like my big like dividing line with the private servers. Like there's nothing that you can do in private servers that you can't do in retail.
I'll be honest, especially looking back at the time, kind of talking to the community, I have a feeling that a lot of the disdain for Abyssia largely comes from the fact that World of Warcraft was stealing massive swaths of the game's population. I think if World of Warcraft, specifically Wrath of the Lich King, wasn't doing that at the time, and the entire player base went on to play Abyssia, I think it would be regarded much more positively than it is now. But the fact that they changed the game so much while Wrath of the Lich King was just absolutely exploding in popularity, I think it's a lot more reasonable to look at the context of that expansion rather than just the fact that a lot of people dislike it, But I completely agree with you. A lot of people who dislike Abyssia, or even dislike Seekers of Adulan, they've never come back to familiarize themselves with the modern endgame. So I've always found their opinions of the modern endgame to be a little bit lopsided, or even modern story content, So it's just, the Abyssia thing is really, really mind-boggling, especially for a new player who wasn't there at the time, so I'm glad to hear that you ran into a lot of trouble similar to me when it came to talking about Abyssia.
Less than you might think, at least in the video thus far, but also the video, is still under 1,000 views. I released it paired with a video of, like, ranking the Chrono games, and I also included fan games and spiritual successors because I thought that would make it more fun, and it'd be fun to examine, like, the artistic merits of those projects. And the Chrono video got a lot more... It was much more divisive. But the 11 video, for the most part, everyone kind of agreed with me except for like one or two commenters. And so it was more people being like, yeah, the post-Abyssia haters need to calm down, which I was surprised that was the general consensus with the video. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy with it, but I was expecting sort of a reverse where I thought the Chrono video would be more like, oh yeah, this is all in good fun. And the 11 video would be a bit more of like a battleground, and it was the complete opposite. The 11 video was mostly a love fest, and then the Chrono video was much more like, these aren't real Chrono games. I'm just like, well, yeah, I told you that in the intro, but that's what we're doing here.
I'll be honest, probably the only reason there isn't much of a debate in your comment section at the moment is no one shared it on the Auction House forum. The minute someone does, you're going to have a lot of haters come through there, I'm telling you.
Well, you know what? I'm not going to engage with them because until they can give me something in a private server that you can't do in retail, I'm just going to consider the arguments invalid. It's piracy, and it's just the game with less content. And that's where I stand with it. Like I said, if they made a new expansion in a private server, I would think that is awesome, and I would jump on board. But in my opinion, it's a lot easier to remove something from a game than to add something to a game. And I'm not very impressed artistically with just like, we just removed content. Cool. You made it better.
I'm not nearly as harsh on private servers. The vast majority of players I've talked to who do play, say, on Horizon or other private servers, they also say subscribe to retail. I'm glad to hear that. I do find myself agreeing
Which
with
I
you
do
more.
appreciate.
Yeah,
I do think that's a good thing.
definitely. I do find myself agreeing with you, though. It's really a shame that a lot of people who play on these private servers, they've never tried modern endgame. So if endgame is what they're wanting, they don't realize there are literal thousands and thousands of hours to be doing in modern Final Fantasy XI. They just assume that everything is really easy and casual, which, I don't know. If you're trying to get a full set of Empyrean plus 3 and some Prime weapons for a couple jobs, you're going to be playing the game for months and months and months. It's sad to me that no one wants to give Modern 11 a chance. Speaking of which, why do you think 11 is so shunned? Especially with the popularity of 14, you'd think a lot more people would be coming back to try it. But that's not really what I've seen. A lot of people are just dismissing 11 outright, saying it's too old, or they never even look into it. Why do you think that is?
So I think with 11 being skipped as much of it is, I think it's a matter of, it was really easy to skip it at the time it came out. I think that's the first big factor, is that there was a pretty big barrier to entry, because this is, 2003, 2004. At that time, internet access isn't as widely available across the United States. Like, a lot of rural areas are, don't have high-speed internet. A lot of people are still using dial-up back then. And beyond that, it's also really expensive. So if you're like, a kid who came into the series in like Final Fantasy VII, you're like a young teenager around that time, you got to convince your parents to like, hey, buy this game, which, by the way, if I play it, it'll eat up the phone line, so you can't make any phone calls. It's going to be like the most expensive video game you've ever bought me, because it's going to be like $120. You're going to have to buy this adapter, hook it up to the PlayStation. I'm going to be playing with strangers online. And by the way, there's a monthly fee. Like, that is a big sell in the era of dial-up internet. So I think a lot of fans didn't do it for that reason. And then a lot of fans, when the game launched, it was super grindy, and so it just got this reputation of being like hard and not having story, which at the time of launch was kind of fair. There was a story there, but it was very difficult to get through because of how hard the game was. So it made it very skippable in that sense. And you had 10-2 as sort of like an alternative to that. So you had 10-2, so like you could sort of easily like replace it with another mainline title. Then, as the years went on, because so many people skipped it, they just viewed it as not essential. And because like signing up for the game like is a bit of a hassle. Like, you do have to, go through that entire process. It's not just like, download on Steam, go. Like, there's a process to it. And so there's all these barriers to entry that make it more difficult. But I am surprised with the popularity of 14 and how many people are playing 14 that people aren't even giving 11 a shot. That is the part that surprised me, where like people will have played every Final Fantasy game, including, 14, 16, like everything, all the mainline ones. Like, yeah, haven't played 11, won't ever play it. And that's the part that, I still don't get. Like, if you're that big of a fan of the series that you're going to play 15 other games, why not just be a completionist and at least dabble in that one? So that I do find that a bit weird.
One thing that I think surprises me in particular is the fact that a lot of YouTube channels that specialize in Final Fantasy content seem to, I won't say shun it, but like, for instance, Final Fantasy Union has shifted from covering mainly single-player games. They've incorporated a lot of 14 into their content, but not a lot of 11. Night Sky Prince, he made a video talking about like the golden age of Final Fantasy. He talks about the Dark Age being the mid to late 2000s, or perhaps the early to mid, but then he doesn't even talk about the fact that 11 expansions were coming out, and they were phenomenal.
Fantasy X in 2001. Oh, and then Final Fantasy XI in 2002. All of this is to say that from 1997 to 2002, we only went 1 year without a mainline Final Fantasy title. There were 11 mainline Final Fantasy titles, and in the past 20 years, we've only received just 4 numbered titles. Also generally acclaimed as one of the best games in the franchise, if not the best. The game is also receiving a graphical overhaul by next expansion, as well as new support for the trust system, allowing players to solo most of the game's story, playing it as though it was a single-player game.
Final Fantasy Union in particular, I remember this, they did a video about all of the things that Final Fantasy was doing, I think in the year of 2023. That was a huge year for Final Fantasy XI. Again, Prime weapons were kind of a big buzz. The Voracious Resurgence was finally having its finale. There was a really big announcement of some new Master Trials, so a lot of statics. They were getting ready to race those Master Trials, to prog them. Final Fantasy Union said, yeah, they're having a discount, and that's all they said about 11 in 2023. They talked about, 7 Rebirth, they talked about 16, but then when it came to 11, it's had its biggest year in perhaps, 5 or 6 years, and they just said that the game was having a discount, and then they moved on. It struck me as so funny.
Final Fantasy XI had launched the Return Home to Vana'diel campaign and the Discount campaign. Both were planned to bring old players back to the game ahead of what promises to be another year for the MMO that just keeps on trucking. The initial campaign did end on the 5th of January, but the Discount campaign will run until the 13th of January, and this sees the Ultimate Collection Seekers Edition reduced by 68%.
Well, that just also strikes you just them just like not paying attention and not knowing about it, because like for 11, just most people just don't have like an awareness of like what the game even is or what it's like currently. The common misconception like, oh, is 11 even still online, when they just like wrapped up a new major storyline. So, people just, I think, just don't really have a good conception of like what the game actually is, which is one reason why I am still glad I made my video, because it's like, no, this is actually what 11 is. From beginning to present day, this is the overall, storyline of all these different expansions, what they're kind of like, general vibe. And I think just people just don't know what it is and just haven't bothered looking into it. I think that's, partially where people like us come in to like explain like, no, here's actually what 11 is, as opposed to like, Pro Jared did a review of Final Fantasy XI, but he said, like, yeah, I played on private servers and, like, only played a little bit of, like, a couple of expansions.
For the sake of this video, I especially wanted to talk about how it was when I played it, closer to when it first came out. So for that, I've been playing on a private server known as Eden, which is Final Fantasy XI up through its 3rd expansion pack, Treasures of Atorgan, about early 2006 era or so.
And so no one has actually explained like the breadth of what Final Fantasy XI is, and I get why, because there's so much there, and it can be kind of hard to explain because there's so much there. I think it's important that someone try to, because there's so much good stuff there, and I think people are just really sleeping on it.
Yeah, it's funny. Pro Jared said that most people agree that Chains of Promethea's story is pretty good, so it's pretty obvious he never played through it. And I think that's really funny, because it'd be really weird to describe like Final Fantasy 6 or 7 as the story being pretty good. Most people agree that it's pretty good, but it's, it's really, really good. It's just he played on a private server and couldn't get through a lot of those storylines.
All of this makes it much easier to play through the pretty good story. Most players agree that the Chains of Promethea storyline is great.
That video in particular, I really enjoy it, but it's kind of a shame that he didn't bother to like go into what Modern 11 is like, kind of in his 14 video that he recently did.
Yeah, and I think that's where I understand why there aren't more Final Fantasy XI reviews out there, because it is so long going through all that content. However, I wish that people like who reviewed Final Fantasy XI didn't just like, yeah, I dipped my toes in some of it and didn't really like finish any of the storylines. Like, that's not really... I feel like there's a middle ground to maybe doing it the way I did, where I beat all the main story, to like not even finishing Chains of Promethea. Like there's got to be some middle ground in between the two, as like what constitutes like an appropriate review of what the game has to offer.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's also one of the reasons that I wanted to review each of the expansions as standalone titles. If someone wants to learn a little bit about 11, they can pop in and watch the Treasures of Atorgan video and then leave, and, they have an idea for what 11 might offer. But, like you said, even compared to doing an entire series, there's a lot of, review real estate, so to speak. There are a lot of different ways to approach talking about the game, other than just dabbling in a private server for a couple weeks and then making a video about it. By the way, no shame to any of these YouTubers. 11 is a monolithic game. And like in Final Fantasy Union's case, I don't blame them for not sinking 400, 500 hours into a game to cater to less than 1% of their audience. So if I was in their shoes, I'd probably do the exact same thing, perhaps even Pro Jared. I don't blame them at all. It's just unfortunate for me being a really big fan of 11,
With Final Fantasy Union, like, given how many people are working on that, I would wish there was, like, someone who at least, like, even if they're not actively playing 11, would understand that, like, hey, there's a new expansion storyline that wrapped up. Like, not just, like, oh, there was a discount. Like, doing, like, a little bit more research on that. Because, like, even before I started playing 11, I was aware that the Voracious Resurgence was a thing. Like, it was already a thing right when I was starting up and gearing up to play 11. So I feel like it's not that hard to figure out if I hadn't even played 11 to, like, understand that Voracious was a thing. So I think there's a little bit more they could do. Like, if you're a full-time Final Fantasy channel discussing everything going on with all the games, if you're bothering to talk about 11 at all, you should probably know that. So I'm going to be, like, slightly more critical, but not that much more critical. Like, I don't expect them to play through it, but I do expect them to know what it is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, speaking of Final Fantasy XI content, let's get into some of the ranking. You probably have more experience when it comes to these ranking discussions, too, than I do. Just literally
I did a podcast with this ranking format for, like, 3 years, and we're actually just about to gear it up back next weekend.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really
So I'm
awesome.
very familiar with this format. So trust me, I got this. We're good.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, we'll start with the bottom one, which turned out to be A Crystalline Prophecy. So, do you want to kind of talk about why you dislike this one so much?
Yes, and to explain the ranking system for folks at home, so we've got 12 items we're ranking. Top item in our ranking, which we'd say is the best 11 expansion or scenario, gets 12 points. Least best gets 1 point. And then, if in the event of a tie, whichever one gets the lowest individual point loses a tiebreaker. So if something got 1 point, like whatever is the lowest individual point loses the tie. If it's the exact same point value between different things, there's a coin flip. So this one tied for bottom, but lost with a coin flip. A Crystalline Prophecy. I ranked it bottom. You ranked it second from the bottom. So neither one of us were like, we have a general consensus on what the bottom two are in this ranking. And the thing with A Crystalline Prophecy is that it is unfortunately bad on both a... Yeah, I don't like calling it bad, but I think that if you do have to call anything in Mainline 11 bad, this does kind of qualify for me. Bad narratively and bad gameplay-wise, where narratively it has the possibly strongest premise out of like all the Kato mini expansions, where it's finally paying off the storyline of the intro movie, which was so good. So it has that going for it. But it doesn't commit to like fully resolving that arc and changing the status quo in 11 and just leaves things in this sort of awkward state of limbo. And so it's taken this great idea for a story and just really fumbling it. And so it's one thing if just like the premise wasn't interesting and then the resolution wasn't interesting, but it's almost more painful because you had something so good and then you just completely fumble it. And then beyond that, it's the most annoying gameplay I've ever had in 11, where it reduces. You go into Delphut's tower, and it reduces your level to 1, and you can't summon trust or anything, and so you have to just try not to die. And it was really annoying. So like, the gameplay was frustrating, and the story was frustrating because I wanted it to be good. I was so invested in the concept, and it just didn't commit. And I think that's the problem with this.
Speaking of the gameplay in particular, at least for me, one issue is, like, for instance, with the other two mini expansions, if you're familiar with that type of gameplay, if you're already doing it, it's going to be really easy. You'll be able to blow past it pretty quick. A Crystalline Prophecy, it doesn't matter if you've done that a lot throughout your time in 11, like actually exploring the world with Sneak and Invisible, or if you've never done it before, you're going to have the same exact slog as everyone else. So there's really no way to ease the gameplay, let's say, drudgery of that. Furthermore, everyone in 11, I would argue, has experienced what it's like to sneak through a dungeon with both Sneak and Invisible. So it's not really asking you to do anything new. That's, at least for me, one thing that I really didn't appreciate about that particular mini expansion. So yeah, moving on to the next one. Actually, before we move on, as far as the story too, Aldo is one of my favorite characters in 11. I don't feel like that mini expansion did him justice, just for me personally. I really wish they would have delved into kind of his situation a little bit more than they did.
I fully agree, and as mentioned in my 11 video, I'm pretty sure Kato felt this too, because I don't think it's a coincidence the main character in Another Eden is named Aldo and rescues his sister from Beastmen. Like, that is not a coincidence at all. I think he's like, no, I didn't nail this. I got to do it again. And then, Another Eden, luckily, is that home run, which, like, yes. So I think he did realize the failures of this, and luckily he did rectify it in later work.
Yeah, so you might be able to say that Another Eden is part of the main story of 11 too, right?
I wouldn't go that far. I know some people think I play really fast and loose with what I consider main story of 11, but I'm not going to say Another Eden is main story of FF11. Although I would say if you are really invested in the Aldo storyline in Final Fantasy XI and you like Chrono Trigger, I would recommend another Eden because it's a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, and it does give you that emotional payoff you might have been wanting from a Crystalline Prophecy that you didn't get in 11.
Well, there you have it. If you're interested in that particular story, be sure to check that game out. As far as Abyssea, this is the next one on the list. This is the second worst. And again, I don't necessarily think any of this stuff is just straight up bad, but it clearly does not have the same quality as anything else. Do you want to start things off as to why you dislike Abyssea?
So actually, I don't dislike Abyssea. The rest of the list, I'm actually pretty positive on. It's just like there's a pretty big chasm between a Crystalline Prophecy and everything else. So like we both agreed what the bottom two should be. We just had them in a different order. You put Abyssea at the bottom. I put a Crystalline Prophecy at the bottom. But we both agreed these are the bottom two. Abyssea is, I mean, it's Battlefield content. It's just a flimsy excuse to go around and fight stuff. Like, that's what it is. There's not that much story, but what it does do, like, it does have, like, a really great sense of atmosphere. It has a great vibe to it. The music in Abyssea is phenomenal. And so really, like, this one just, like, is carried solely off of vibes. Just the vibes of Abyssea are cool. It's a little bit repetitive gameplay-wise, but once you figure out the gameplay loop, it's easy enough to understand. Like, you can wrap your head around what Abyssea is pretty reasonably. And if you go in with a battle plan, it doesn't take as long as you might think, given, like, what the content is. If you're doing the main story of Abyssea, trying to get to Shinryu, like, it's actually, you know, normal-ish expansion length, just with a lot less story, and it's mostly just, you know, vibing with the gameplay. And so I enjoyed it for what it was. If someone says the gameplay of Abyssea sucks and the story of Abyssea sucks, like, I'm not going to argue with them too hard. That's the critique of Abyssea I think is fair, is the gameplay and story. I think the changes to the 11 overall critiques I don't respect as much. But if you're just like, man, Abyssea's story is kind of lame and it's too grindy, I'm like, yeah, okay, I will concede that point. But I enjoyed it for what it was.
I don't think Abyssea was necessarily bad. That having been said, when I did my research on all of the expansions, I kind of found out how the developers went about developing some of this stuff. So one thing about Abyssea is while it did add a lot of new equipment, 11 had by that point, I think 7 or 8 years of experience adding equipment, but also making the endgame bigger at the same time. This is one thing Abyssea somewhat failed at. I was really wanting to see that the Magian Trials gave the ability to upgrade all equipment. In fact, that's a similar issue that I have with Ambuscade in Modern 11. If they were going to do Abyssea properly, I completely agree with you. The game is better now, at least for me, than it was before. I really wish that they would have made the Magian Trials a little bit more exhaustive in giving you the abilities to upgrade all of the equipment that you've been collecting, rather than a small few. As far as gameplay and story, though, like say, there not a lot of gameplay and story to Abyssea. I do agree, I love the Abyssea zones, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say any of this stuff is bad, because I actually quite like all of this stuff. But as you'd mentioned, for me, Abyssea really was the thing that I enjoyed least in all of 11.
I do think I should, add this asterisk here. I am very much not a like gear guy. I'm not an MMO grind guy. So I have, dipped my toes barely in the endgame of 11, only so much as, like, it allowed me to experience the main story. So, like, I've done Sortie, but only because of the, its requirement for Voracious. So, like, I don't engage in, like, Omen content or stuff like that, or, Ambuscade, unless it's, like, a requirement. I'm not one of those guys who's like, oh, man, I got to get all those pieces of gear, which I understand is, like, important for, like, those, endgame fights. But I don't have expertise in that. I'm a story-first player. I'm a guy who plays Final Fantasy games for the story, play the rest of the main lines, love them. But as far as, like, expertise and, like, specific mechanics, I am not the guy. So I'm just putting that out there for the folks at home who disagree with what I'm saying.
For me, I personally am not too much into that. That having been said, I did at least once engage with almost every single piece of content in this game. I haven't beaten everything, TVR, or the Voracious Resurgence. I haven't finished. Back in September, when I decided between making a video series or finishing TVR, I went with the video series. I do think it's really interesting to hear your perspective coming strictly from a story perspective. For me, some of my opinions about some of the expansions have somewhat shifted or been blurred because of my impressions of the gameplay stuff. So I think it's nice to have kind of this balance of perspectives on each of the expansions. Speaking of which, the next one is Rise of the Zillart.
Yeah, so I say Xylart, you say Zillart, potato. So we've got these next three are in a three-way tie, but based upon the ranking system, this is the one that ends up lowest in the three-way tie. So I think Rise of the Xylart, I think I understand why it's popular among 11 fans, but I don't think it's as good as people act like it is, in the sense that this was, base 11 for a lot of people in North America. Like, this was just included with the game, and so people just treat it like what Final Fantasy 11 originally was. And so I think there's a lot of nostalgia for Rise of the Xylart because of, like, when it came out. But I think if you put it side by side against something like Secrets of a Dueling, the quality gap is, in my opinion, really massive and really favors Seekers to Rise of the Xylart. Even just, like, on a gameplay level of just, like, the way the maps are designed, the general pacing of, like, the main story to gameplay. I think it, like, even the direction of the cutscenes, like, it blows all that out of the water. But taking all that aside, I don't think the story for this expansion is super great. I think the retcon at the beginning of the expansion, which people debate, like, no, it's not really a retcon, because at the end of base 11, there's all those flashes, and you don't see what happens in between those flashes. If your story of an expansion begins like, don't you remember what just happened? What? You forgot? Let me remind you what just happened. I consider that a retcon. I think it weakens the ending of base 11 with what they did with Rise of the Xylart. Like, that retcon is just, for me, it's one of the worst examples of Final Fantasy writing. I don't like that retcon. I think that Camelot is not that interesting of a character. Like, he looks really cool. I love Nomura designs. You get Nomura to design a character, I'm probably going to be all in for that. I'm going to be like, yeah, that guy looks rad. But his writing isn't interesting. I like the twist where he's ultimately not the final boss of the expansion, not the main villain. So I think that's cool. I think the Lion is great. I think the Gilgamesh is great. I think Norg, a lot of these locations are awesome. But I think, like, the fundamental story is just really flimsy and weak. And as a story first player, it's like, yeah, this is like one of the weaker stories in the game, so that's why I rank it lower.
For me, it's a little bit tough. I really enjoyed Rise of the Xylart. There's one particular portion, I believe it's the Headstone Pilgrimage. Trying to get through the Den of Rancor, if memory serves correctly, was a headache and a half. Other than that, though, the primary reason why I enjoyed it was because I was talking to another player while I was playing through Rise of the Xylart. I'm now flip-flopping on that pronunciation. He had mentioned to pay attention to the environment throughout the expansion. And what I didn't realize earlier on, but did after revisiting many of the zones, is there is a lot of environmental storytelling in that expansion. More than in the base game, and way more than in any of the other following expansions. It gives Rise of the Xylart really one of the most unique feels in the game. Here's the thing, I agree with you though. I don't think the quality of this expansion is nearly as good as any of the following ones. I really enjoyed it though, which kind of makes it difficult for me to rank this one. You can enjoy something isn't as good as other things. So that's kind of where I fall. A really, really good example of this, and I talked about it in my video, it's probably one of my favorite moments in 11, is your first visit to the Hall of the Gods. I remember thinking to myself immediately when I went in and found that the door at the end of the hallway was locked. I thought, well, why in the world would the game have you visit this? You turn around, and for me, I wasn't familiar with Promathia at that time. I saw his statue and I thought, what on earth is that? Hearing about Altana for the entire base game and some in the rank 10 missions. You turn around and you see something else. It was one of those moments that stuck with me, throughout the entire experience. So I agree the quality isn't as good as any of the following stuff. I really, really enjoyed this expansion though.
I want to address 2 points quick. I think the maps are really good in Rise of the Xylart, so I'm not going to disagree with that. And I think you could argue that, like, in some ways they're better than maybe, like, some of the maps in Treasures of Outergon, where they're, like, a little bit too convoluted and confusing. So, like, I think the maps are good. But I will say, the other point is that if Rise of the Xylart came out at the time that Secrets of a Dueling came out, it would not be held nearly as high as regard. The reason it is held in as high of regard as it is because of when it came out, rather than just the quality of the content itself, in my opinion. Like, it's usually ranked, like, top 2 or 3 11 expansions by, like, a lot of people. I think if it came out, like, you switch the order of release of Seekers, came out when this did, and Rise of the Xylart came out when Seekers did, the opinion of it would plummet amongst the general fan base, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective, and I can definitely see that. When talking to some people about this expansion, a lot of them like to say that it is the best and most intricate of the expansions. And oftentimes when I ask them, how long ago it was that they played it, it was back in 2003, 2004 when they beat the expansion. So I can somewhat agree with that, even though I myself really enjoyed it. Next up, Final Fantasy XI's base game. So for this one, we're counting everything up to rank 10. So both the Shadow Lord arc and all of the individual nation mission pathways. You want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, so if I'm doing like a ranking of, if I was separating the nation missions from everything else, like there would actually be like some wider variance in terms of like where base 11 would rank. So Windurst base 11, I rank really, really high. Sandoria base 11, I rank pretty low, towards the bottom of the list. And Bastet base 11, not better than most of the expansions, but like still like definitely like a solid, enjoyable time. So there's a lot of variance in this. And so I think with base 11, the beginning parts of the game are generally not super interesting until you get to the Shadow Lord arc, with the exception of Windurst, which is actually interesting from basically the beginning. So yeah. Bastok at the beginning, Sandor at the beginning, not super interesting. The Shadow Lord arc across all three is great. And then, Bastok after rank 5 is pretty fun. Sandoria after rank 5, you get some cool locations, but the story just goes nowhere. And then Windurst is just like good and maybe not on the quality of like some of the best expansions, but like reasonably competitive, and it was a very pleasant surprise. Like I started in Bastok, and then before I did Wings of the Gods, I went back and did Sandoria and Windurst. Just because I decided, I'll do extra credit. I want to make sure I really enjoy Winds of the Goddess. I'll go back and check them out. And I was surprised at how good Windurst was from beginning to end, and how, like, mid Sandoria was from beginning to end. But so when factoring all of that in, factoring like the great writing of the Shadow Lord, the fact that these are like, there are some incredible locations, Bastok, Sandoria, Windurst, and all those locations in the base game like are iconic and beautiful and well designed, and the foundation upon which the game is built. Yes, it's grindy. Yes, the story isn't super great in the beginning for most of the nations, but there is a lot of good here in the base game, and so it was probably the toughest one for me to, rank, but I'm pretty much happy where it ended up in the ranking. I think I would have had it one spot higher in my ranking, but in terms of overall ranking, yeah, this is a pretty good place for it.
I'm not sure if you know this. I believe I have this right. The person who wrote the Windurst storyline is the same person who wrote, Chains of Promathia, Seekers of Adulan, and Rhapsodies. And I believe also TVR.
All right, so basically that guy is great. Yeah. Good job.
I think, if memory serves correctly, her writing on the Windurst path was specifically why she was chosen for Chains of Promathia and the newer stuff. So, yeah, all of her work, absolutely phenomenal. I'm a really big fan. Some of the dialogue, some of the way she wrote the dialogue in Chains of Promathia, I think is a little bit contrived, but it's really forgivable given how complex that expansion is. We'll get to Chains of Promathia, though. It is among my favorites, so it might be a little while. As far as base game, I view it a little bit like A Realm Reborn, where a lot of people have a hard time getting into some of the better stuff in 14 because they hit base game and literally the first 3 ranks, you're not really doing anything interesting unless you pick the hardest path that is Windurst, And if you pick Windurst, that filters a lot of players. What is it, the Mage's Gate or something? Do you remember that? There was a particular optional mission where if you accidentally accept it, you have to do like a 3-hour quest line that's really, really difficult.
Which I did have to do. I think that was where like you had to fight Diabolos like a whole bunch of times or something like that. So I do remember that, and also the difficulty of that one part in the dungeon where like you need like a small group of mages, or you had to do like the Mage Gate. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but point is, Windurst makes it like hard for no reason. But that is also, isn't that the true essence of Final Fantasy XI? Hard for no reason.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And we have some really, really good cases of that a little bit later on. But I really enjoyed base game. I've talked to a ton of new players who got about halfway through to rank 6, and they wound up dropping the game. So, at least from my perspective, talking to a bunch of new players, it does have that, the A Realm Reborn problem of Final Fantasy XI, which is funny because it's way older than 14, but that problem is so famous that I think it fits here, kind of reapplying it.
I think it's worse here than in A Realm Reborn, which I like 11 way more than 14. But I think that A Realm Reborn is much better than base 11, and so like that is it is a barrier because people just like, oh, that's what this game is. I'm good, and I get it.
Yeah, and not only that, you have to get acclimated to all of the gameplay systems in 11 while you're doing probably the very worst content in 11. So I think, if anything, debate, like you said, it's so much worse than A Realm Reborn because people are playing an old school MMO for the first time while they're going and finding an orcish axe for the Sandorian knight that doesn't really need it, So
Right.
it does have some issues. Next up is Ashantoto's Ascension. Yeah, tell us what you think about this one.
So this is interesting because, as we talked earlier, like a lot of people lump the Kato expansions together as just one big thing. But I think the quality variance across them is like pretty great, as evidenced by like how much higher a Shantoto Ascension ranked than a Crystalline Prophecy. So I mean, this is the one with crafting, which I did not engage in any of the game's crafting mechanics before this expansion, but it wasn't that bad once I did it. Like I plowed through it. Shantoto, she's I don't know anyone who plays 11 who doesn't skip the cutscenes that doesn't like Shantoto. Like, if you've watched 11 cutscenes at all, basically everybody likes Shantoto. She's usually in everyone's, like, top 5 favorite characters from the game. Like, everyone likes Shantoto. That's why she's the mascot in, like, Dissidia and such. She's a great character. It's a fun storyline. It's nice to have her take center stage. The mechanics are overall good. It's, like, this is a fun time. It's a fun story. It's engaging throughout. It's funny. It's got good twists and turns. It is a great little bite-sized story, and I mentioned this in my 11 video. I am impressed that Kato was able to write around the storytelling handicap of Shantoto, the NPC, always being in her house the entire time, and you can always just talk to her no matter what's going on in the storyline of this expansion. That is freaking great. So I'm a big fan of this one.
Shantoto as the mascot 11. I really like Shantoto as a character. It strikes me as really odd that she was the one who was chosen, though. A really good example of this
who would you pick otherwise?
Personally, I think the two that I would pick, I'm not sure which of the two, it'd either be Zaid, I think you call him Zaid, or Lion. Those two characters, they start off in Bastok, or any of the Nation missions, but they start in the base game, you see them in the first expansion, and you pretty much see them through quest lines, they're referenced, you see them throughout pretty much the entire game. Lion comes back, of course, almost everyone does, towards the end of the game for Rhapsodies of Vana'diel.
And Zaid is in that one as well, and they're also both in Xylart.
There, again, lot...
Here's...
Go ahead.
The counter I would give is I think Zaid is... If you're doing, like, representatives from all the games, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of Dissidia, I think Zaid, with his really, really dark backstory, might be, like, too much of a villain to, like, represent Warrior of Light. But I think Shantoto being, like, a troll anti-hero makes her an interesting presence among, like, all the other FF heroes. So I think the difference in her personality, but still technically being a good guy, I think is where, like, her flair comes in. But I could definitely see Lion being, like, a, representative hero. But, Zaid, when we get into, like, some of his story stuff that's revealed in Wings of the Goddess, I don't know if his personality and backstory is too dark to be, like, on the side of Warriors of Light.
Yeah, that's understandable. I still think Lion's a really good case to make, though.
She's designed by Nomura. That's a plus right there.
This mini expansion, like, say, crafting is one of those things that I hardly engaged into. In fact, it took me forever to beat this because I really didn't feel like going through that slog. But I do agree that as far as the mini expansions, or I like to call them add-ons, again, it's just terminology. As far as the Kato content, this is definitely better than Crystalline Prophecy. Next up, we have TVR, which I admit I've never beat the Voracious Resurgence. I've started and done a couple missions in it. Haven't beat it, though, so you're going to have to kind of give your impressions about this.
Yeah, so this is, with a giant asterisk. It's ranked based upon your current impressions. I did a ranking when I was playing through all the expansions, and when the Voracious was, like, midway through its development, and I'd beaten all the content up to that point. I ranked all of them. And so Voracious ended up moving down one spot after I finished it. And I'll discuss, that a bit later. But I do think it's... The Voracious Resurgence is, I think, a small miracle that this even exists. The fact that they were able to pull this off with, like, their limited development budget and staff is amazing. And so that alone makes me, like, really favorable towards it. It's got really great music. The gameplay is challenging but rewarding. Like, it doesn't seem, nothing here seems unfair. So it has all of that going for it. But I think there's like a beauty to it where like the story of the race's resurgence is about like a return to normalcy and just like a new adventure in 11 after the epicness of Rhapsodies. And so I think that when it's coming out in 2020 during the pandemic, when everyone just wants a return to normalcy, I thought that was like a beautiful statement to do a storyline like focusing on like a return to normalcy and something a bit more calm. And I think that comfort is beautiful, but I think the story itself is really good. They get into really good lore with Odin and the Galka race. I think the villains are very strong. Like I said, the combat is hard but really satisfying. I'm very impressed with this one overall. And then the biggest thing that's impressive is how you could tell they didn't have the budget for new locations, but they were able to use old locations in such a way to make them really interesting. Where like you get this entire side quest, not side quest, but like this entire mini arc, this chapter of the story in Race and Jima, which had previously just been like, oh, that's where like the end of Rhapsodies is, and that's that scary area with the emptiness. But like if the emptiness is gone, like that's just now just another place. And so the fact that you're going back to Race and Jima for an entire story arc is great. And using like the Altepa Desert in interesting ways, like they're able to use all these locations from 11 and make it feel like a full expansion despite having to reuse a lot of old locations. And it works, and I'm very impressed with it. The one thing that, is like this creeping dread is that the ending, there's a couple plot threads they leave unresolved for like a potential future sequel. And I don't know if we're ever going to get it. But also everyone is thinking like, oh, 11's going to end any day now. They've been thinking that since 2007. So maybe we will get a new expansion storyline that continues the unresolved plot threads. I would be surprised. I personally don't think it'll happen. I think this probably is after the end of 11, but I mean, everyone who has said that has been wrong, so I hope I'm wrong. That's my takeaways from this. Very impressive overall, good characters, good story. I like the new things they added, and I'm very impressed it even exists.
Speaking of unfinished threads, one thing that kind of irked me before I knew about TVR was the fact that, again, this is more gameplay stuff, but Empyrean armor you couldn't fully upgrade compared to Relic and Artifact. To me, if you're going to do the final storyline, you might as well finish all of the Ultimate Gear acquisition quests, and they left that unfinished. And then I found out about TVR, and I thought, well, that's a relief. So, yeah, I'm glad that it wound up tying that up. And while I don't have my Empyrean Plus 3 yet, I would love to get it at some point. You said that you wound up downgrading it after finishing it, though. Why is that?
So the thing is, I actually ranked it higher than Rhapsodies initially, which we'll get to later. But after finishing Rhapsodies and finishing, after having some time away from it, I think that TVR is actually better than Rhapsodies gameplay-wise. Like, if you actually play them like side by side, TVR has a much better gameplay to story balance. Like, it's not so lopsided towards the other. But I think the good things that Rhapsodies does so well outshines the Voracious Resurgence in terms of like the better like balance that game has. Is this better than Rhapsodies? If you're looking at it as a video game, probably yes. But if you're looking at like the story and emotional payoff, no. So that's where my flip ended up happening.
Like you said, I'm really glad that TVR came out. I'm really looking forward to finishing it. Right now, work's keeping me very busy though, so I probably won't be finishing. I hear that. Yeah. Probably not going to be finishing that anytime soon. That having been said, I am really itching to get back to it. I know the New Year's message about the producer and now director saying that he's not going to be doing any big content for the year. It's kind of made a lot of people concerned, because this is quite literally, I think, the slowest year that Final Fantasy XI has ever gotten. That having been said, they are doing a lot of work on the servers for the game. Whether or not that's work to start adding more content or work to finally shut the game down, I think it's anyone's guess, but I also don't think it's reasonable to say the game is, I don't think it's reasonable to say they're done with the game, all because they're having one slow year, I don't think they've ever done this much work to the servers since apparently the game started. I could be wrong about that, though. A lot of people are pessimistic, but I don't think there's any cause for pessimism yet. I still think the game has a little bit of life left in it, especially with the collaboration that's coming to 14.
Yeah, with that collaboration coming to 14, I think you're going to get a lot of people, if not checking out the game, at least checking out some YouTube videos on 11, so that'll be good for us. But if I had to like guess, and this is just completely no factual basis, I would say 11 is winding down and might be moving into like eliminating a number of servers, like consolidating them into mega servers, and then it might be moving into like free to play if they're just done adding expansion content. We're just like you buy the game, they just like host a couple mega servers, is what I would like guess would be the future of 11. But let's say like the 14 crossover does really well and there's enough renewed interest, maybe they will do another storyline, a small one or something like that, and maybe just like a few missions that resolves the plot threads of TVR where like they set it up for a full sequel, but it'll probably just be maybe just do a couple missions to be like, hey, we took care of that villain, he's done now. So I don't know. Open to possibilities, but I would be unsurprised if the game just kind of like limped along for another 10 years without any new main story added. Like, that would not surprise me either.
Yeah, that makes sense. If they do make another expansion and they're able to include new zones, I would be very disappointed if both Valhalla and Tartarus don't get full zones. I've heard, again, I haven't finished it, but it's kind of a bummer that Valhalla didn't get a full zone. And I know that Tartarus, they literally had a lot of development done for Seekers of Adullam having a 6th chapter, but they never did it. So I'm curious if maybe that cut content might serve as a good baseline for a new expansion. Don't know how they would do it. In fact, the writer who just recently wrapped up TVR, she said that if she did another story, I think it would be more in the Far East rather than focusing on any of those esoteric locations. But we'll see. Moving on, we have Amugos Coupo d'Etat. Talk to us about that.
I mean, this is freaking rad. I mean, there's different kinds of RPG players. There are the folks who are the guys who really hate the mascot characters and hate that Choo Choo is in Xenogears. And then there's folks like me who love that Choo Choo is in Xenogears. I love that in, this dark, brooding game with like, a complex world history and, psychology and religion, that there's a pink mascot character. Like, I enjoy the campy, ridiculous parts of Final Fantasy and RPGs. I am down for that. And so the fact that this is just like a campy story about like you and your Moogle friend fighting the Moogle Mafia is freaking great. I love it. It is hilarious like the whole way through. The gameplay here is pretty fun the entire way through. Like the forced mechanic, sorry, I bumped my microphone there, of having to do like, using the pickaxe and, do some mining, do some logging, do some was that harvesting, I think is the name of the mechanic. Like, I don't mind that. That was actually like kind of fun. So it's like it's good gameplay wise, it's good story wise. It has probably my favorite boss battle in the entire game, the final boss of this expansion. It's just like, it's fun, it's silly, but like the story like isn't bad either. Like, you can have a good story that's just fun, and this is just, it's a fun time. It's feel good, it's fun, it's funny. I just love it. It's great.
One thing I liked about this add-on in particular was the fact that almost every other story in 11, if you know a lot about the lore, then you have a rough idea for what may happen. In Treasures of Ottergon, at least for me, knowing that Promathia was gone, I guess spoiler alert, I was curious if they would be doing anything with the Avatar that had to do with darkness, and come to find out they did. Just, you can make a lot of guesses if you know a lot about the lore. This is not at all the case with this mini expansion. And in fact, it's the only main flagship piece of content that's the case with. The minute it begins, you have no idea where it's going, and that pretty much persists all the way till the end, which I found to be really, really fun.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good time. This is just really, I think I said in my video, it's like it relies on more like cartoon logic. So like if the rest of the game is a Final Fantasy game, this is like I don't know, the Disney show Bonkers. Like, it's just like, it's fun.
So yeah, I do agree. That is the best of the add-ons or mini expansions as far as the I guess the 2009 and 10 stuff. Moving on, the last full expansion for Final Fantasy XI, Seekers of Adullam.
Yeah, so I think we're both in agreement that this is, good. I mean, the rest of the stuff on the list is basically traditional expansion content and Rhapsodies, so, which isn't really surprising that that's where this ends up on the list. I ranked it a little bit higher than you, but also I can understand why someone would not rank it as high. I think there's, like, some parts of the story I can understand people not vibing with as much, but I do think, like, anyone who looks at Seekers and says it's trash and not good content is just, like, wearing nostalgia goggles and didn't actually play through it, because it's really, really great. Like, some of the best designed zones in the game, incredible music, great characters, great story, great lore. Great new gameplay mechanics. Like, I love the survival skills. I think that's a really great addition to the game. Love the Mog Garden. I love that, the live stream is introduced in this expansion. There's just a lot of good here, and yeah, I think it's really excellent, and I think that the only reason why a lot of fans like rank it towards the bottom of expansions is because it came out after Abyssia.
I completely agree. Seekers of Adulan, while I was playing through it, I was relatively convinced that it would be my favorite expansion of all of the expansions. The writing is so good, the characters are so good, the setup really, really interesting. I got to that last chapter, and the pacing really, really shifted, which is ultimately why I wound up ranking it lower, because I was a bit disappointed by the finale. When, again, this is massive spoilers for those who haven't played this story, when King August is reintroduced, you see that there's an entire elaborate magic system that he has that was never even remotely talked about. You could tell Theodore was meant to be a much more relevant character to the story than he was, even though he was quite relevant. I was wanting to see a lot more detail given about that stuff.
And they don't resolve Balamor really. He's just like, oh yeah, where'd he go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can tell he has a plot, and then I think in Rhapsodies you find out that plot is making a new world. But even at that, there was no way to resolve his storyline, in Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, because the focus had already shifted. Mm-hmm. That's the only reason.
And plus he hangs out as an NPC now, so just like, you can't resolve his story ever.
Oh yeah. That's a really good point. Unless you have Kato come back and do something fun.
Right.
That's pretty much the only issue I had with Seekers of Adulan. Almost everything outside of the story's finale I absolutely loved. I loved the lore and idea behind the Naquals. I know this might be controversial, but I think Hades might be the best villain in 11. I know Lady Lilith is also up there, but for me it's almost entirely the way they build up to the villain. Again, you keep hearing about the monster in the Serpentine Labyrinth, and you're curious what in the world it is. And it just leaves you there wondering what in the world Hades is for so long. And finally, when he's introduced, there's this dread. You're talking about one of the most impactful scenes in the game toward the end of the expansion, right? It was that scene where, I'm blanking on some of the names. Moramor is reunited with, what's his name, the tiger?
Dark Cullen?
Yeah.
No, that's that scene. So this is full spoilers. That is, one of the darkest character deaths in a video game ever. And they undo the death later, which I think sort of robs the impact of that scene. But I will say, I am impressed. I do think the ending was rushed, but I did think they did manage to, when they're just like, hey, you have to finish this now, they did manage to make it still work. It definitely wasn't as good as what they had planned, but I still didn't find it to be an unsatisfying ending, just not a amazing ending, but it still worked as an ending to the narrative. But yeah, that Dark Cullen scene is just so incredible. That's one of my favorite Final Fantasy scenes. It is, and the fact that most people just didn't even play the expansion and have no idea that one of the best scenes in the series is deep towards the end of this expansion. It's just the sadness, the anger you feel in that scene of just manipulating Dark Cullen's emotions in that way, and then that betrayal and just the horror, just all that combined, it's just it's incredible stuff. I'm it's a very moving, powerful scene for me.
I completely agree, and for me, the subtext of that scene was just how horrible of a villain Hades wound up being.
Oh yeah, you want to destroy him after that. You're like, dude, exactly. I am gonna vanquish you so hard. I have never wanted to kick someone's ass so much in a video game. I'm just dude, you're going down.
Yeah, and then when I went to fight him, I immediately just got wiped out 20 times before I figured out the right strategy.
Oh no, that is like the Super Saiyan 2 Gohan moment where you're just oh, you're going to be demolished by me now.
That one scene it's what convinced me that Hades might be the best villain in the game. Again, Lilith is an absolutely phenomenal villain. I'm a really, really big fan of Hades, though. Primarily the way they wrote around the villain. And finally, when the villain is introduced, you have that scene that just completely smacks whoever's playing through it in the face. You're exactly right, though. It's a really big bummer that so many people who are Final Fantasy fans have never seen that scene, because I don't think there is anything like it in the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise. At least the main story games.
Oh, I agree. I think it's competitive with the Aerith scene. If I'm putting top 10 Final Fantasy scenes, that's probably there. And it's a huge spoiler, you have to explain all the context behind it as to why it's so great, but just it is it is so powerful. And I don't think I'm going to disagree slightly about Hades as like being as good of a villain, where I think that's like a really great villain move. But in terms of like his overall villain writing, I still think that Lilith is a more interesting character. So, you've got more interesting writing around Hades, and that is a baller villain move. Like that is a top tier villain move. But like in the same way that like Cell had some really good moments, I think that Frieza was a better written character. And so, but like I still think Hades is a great villain, but just not Lady Lilith good, which we'll get to later.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. Next up on the list is Treasures of Ottergon. So yeah, what do you think about this one?
I think this is an excellent expansion. I think it's really great how it's a nice change of pace after Chains of Pramathia, where it's like instead of going for like a grand global scale, we're focusing on a smaller region. Instead of making it like this big overwrought drama, they focus on like a lot of comedy for a good chunk of it. Where like you still have the drama, you still have the big epic moments, but it's focusing on like region and culture and doing like the Final Fantasy 12 tactics thing, but with a lot more levity. I love the lore for Blue Mage. I think the Blue Mage stuff is really, really strong. I think Nashimera is one of the weaker expansion girls. She's likable, but she doesn't have like a super strong personality compared to the other ones, which isn't a fault of her. Just like I just think the other ones are better written and have more interesting designs, and so she just comes off as just like just a little bit less interesting, but she's still likable. Yeah, overall, I definitely like this one. I think King of Hearts is great in this expansion. King of Hearts and Naja, like they make me laugh basically every time they're on screen. Shantoto's great. Yeah, just this one's another winner.
Treasures of Ottergon probably is the expansion I enjoyed the most, because immediately after the story ended, there are so many great quests. Almost all of the content that it introduced is also interesting. At least for me, I really enjoyed some of the assault missions, trying to figure those out. The music for this expansion is also so iconic for me, for Final Fantasy XI now. Anytime I hear the theme that plays inside Whitegate, it just immediately takes me back to the very, very first time I stepped foot in that zone. It has probably the strongest slice of life content in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. You have to kind of wait on schedules, you go into work, at least for me, I was kind of excited to talk to Gesho at the tea house to see what his impressions of Naja were. And all of this is taking place over this really complex political situation, where they're having to deal with what they think is old dead rivals resurrected from the past, A lot of these characters
it's like Seinfeld meets Final Fantasy 12, which is the crossover you didn't know you wanted and needed, but turns out you did.
That's exactly right. It's just one of the most fascinating expansions to me. Treasures of Ottergon, I don't know whether or not I like this more than Chains of Pramathia, but if someone came to me and said that it was way better than Chains of Pramathia, I don't think I would argue with them. I really, really like Treasures of Ottergon. I think I wound up ranking it lower than Chains. That having been said, if you are a Final Fantasy fan and you have not played Treasures of Ottergon, I don't think there are very many experiences that you can play through that are quite as interesting and I guess wacky and enjoyable as Treasures of Ottergon. At least that was my impressions of the expansion.
It's interesting because like I described it in my video as like a Final Fantasy side quest storyline blown up to the size of a mainline game, and that is kind of the charm of it. It's just like it feels like Final Fantasy, but just the vibe is different. It's like a Final Fantasy, slice of life, episodic sitcom kind of thing, but still with like the big epic melodrama and stuff that you want from the series. And so the vibe of it is arguably the most unique in the entire game. Like there's not, the closest would maybe be the Voracious Resurgence to a degree, where you get that slice of life feature back. But Treasure's just like, yeah, it's just the vibe. It has a very distinct vibe that is very good and stands out amongst the rest of the series, mainline in a positive way. And so it's definitely worth it just to experience the entire atmosphere that this expansion brings.
Yeah, definitely. And if for nothing else, Blue Mage is probably my favorite job in all of Final Fantasy. And Blue Mage in this expansion, and 11 as a consequence, absolutely phenomenal. The storyline, the lore behind Blue Mage, and the way that plays into Razfod, Nashimera's brother, absolutely loved everything about the way this job was explored in Treasures of Ottergon. Next up...
full agreement on that.
Yeah. Next up is Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. So, quick disclaimer, this is actually my favorite piece of content in all of 11. Let me know, why do you think it's not as good as some of the other stuff?
So I think, as mentioned, like I view the expansions like sequels. And so there's a sort of like two main ways you can look at Rhapsodies. You can look at it as the main story of Final Fantasy XI, or you can view it as the story of Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. That's the same way you could look at like Marvel movies. You could look at Endgame as the main story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or as a movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. With Rhapsodies, I think Iroha is a great character. I think the final boss in that entire segment with the beautiful music is top notch. I think the ending is moving, and I love the meta commentary there. And I love that you get all the expansion girls. But for me, this feels more like a victory lap, a nostalgia love letter, and has a lot of tributes that like play on your emotions of previous expansions really well. It's not that I don't think the new things that this offer aren't great and that there's not value to those nostalgic tributes, but if I'm looking at like the individual stories and character arcs, I think that I get more out of the narratives of other expansions and the growth that other characters go on in those journeys than I do in Rhapsodies. So I ranked Treasures above Rhapsodies because I think the distinct vibe and those comedy aspects and the amazing, interactions you have with like Nadja and King of Hearts and whatever is better than the nostalgia tribute in Rhapsodies. I think Arcelia is a better character than Iroha, so, Seekers ranks above it. We'll get into Chains and, Wings a little bit later, but I think Rhapsodies, it does really good on tugging on your heartstrings when you played the rest of Final Fantasy XI. But if I'm looking at it as like a chapter in the story, I think that there are other, chapters in the story I thought had stronger individual narratives. And the gameplay in Rhapsodies is made like super cutscene heavy. Like it's mostly cutscenes and then like occasionally you'll do a boss battle, but it's mostly cutscenes. And so that's why I ended up ranking it, towards the middle of the rankings, where super strong ending. I would not blame anyone who said this was their favorite 11 content, and I understand how it's like the culmination of everything. But when I'm like looking at it as an individual piece, which is kind of how I did, that's why it ends up more in the middle for me personally.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I will say, for me, somewhat agree with what you said. Some of the standalone content for Rhapsodies isn't as solid as some of the other stuff. In my review for it, I talked about 6 big contributions that it made to the game. There are 3 that stick out for me, though, that I guess summarize why it's my personal favorite. Probably the first one is the way it gives your player character a little bit more personality without making it difficult to relate to the character you're actually playing. I'm trying not to spoil too much, but the way your character winds up being somewhat of a villain for the vast majority of the story. It's a future version of your own character, so it's easy to kind of project what you imagine your character's personality to be onto that villain. I really enjoyed the way it handled that. The second reason was how it thematically tied everything together. When I first started playing through the game, I saw the Promethean zones, and then I saw the Eska zones, or the Escha zones, however you want to pronounce it. I immediately thought to myself, well, if the emptiness is plaguing both of these zones, then they kind of messed up here. The Eska zones don't look anything like Promethean. And then as the story unfolds, it explains precisely why those two zones look so different. One is a consequence of what Prometheus is doing. The other is a consequence of Prometheus' death. To me, that it contextualized all of the stories of 11, and that click for me, when that story revealed that, it made everything else about 11 so much better than I would have assumed it to be. The last thing is a little bit more of a gameplay reason. It made almost all of the previous years of gameplay relevant to Endgame again. So people immediately started doing Dynamis again because relic armor and relic weapons became relevant, with the new Obro upgrade stuff. There were reasons to go back and get Mythics now that you could upgrade it to 119.3. So just for a couple different reasons, while I agree some of the standalone content might not be as solid, what it did for the game and what it did for all of the other stories is just an invaluable part of Final Fantasy XI for me.
I mean, I agree with pretty much all that, and I would say if not for Rhapsodies, the game might be offline right now. The gameplay changes that Rhapsodies made are basically the reason why newcomers are able to play the game. And so, there are folks who complain that the game is too easy, but, your options are the game is too easy or the game doesn't exist. And I, respect Rhapsodies for the Herculean task of tying all these separate stories together, making new zones despite like super limited budget, finally getting to visit Race and Jima. Like there's a lot of incredible stuff here. And so I don't begrudge anyone who ranks this as their favorite. Like I get it. I completely get it. For me, this is 11 is an embarrassment of riches. There's just so much good stuff here and I just had to stick a number on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of, I guess, Promathia and his impacts, the next on the list is Chains of Promathia. Phenomenal expansion. Every time I talk about this expansion, I feel like I'm being listened to by the entire Final Fantasy XI player base, so it's a funny feeling. Anyway, talk to us about Chains of Promathia.
I was talking about Rise of the Xylart and how there's like the people mainly like that one, I think, because of like nostalgia and less due to the quality of the actual content. And then Chains is the one where just everybody agrees it's good. Newcomers like it, the nostalgia fans like everybody likes it. And the thing is, like, that's the one where I think it's warranted. Rise of the Xylart's high praise in the community, I think is like not as warranted. This is, I think, completely warranted. Like this is top tier Final Fantasy all around. I think the zones in this expansion are some of the most creative in the entire series and some of the coolest areas you can visit in the entire series. Like they're just incredible, and just I'm always going to pronounce it wrong, the Promethean zones. Like the first time you go in there, it is just so freaking cool. Like it is just incredible, and just like it's one of my favorite experiences in the entire series was exploring those zones for the first time. Prish, we haven't talked too much about the expansion girls, which is like a term that I coined in my video, but I think is just like everyone kind of silently agrees is a thing. Prish is one of the top expansion girls, and you could easily argue she's like the best. Like, there's a couple where like if someone says, "Oh, that's the best expansion girl," I won't argue. And if someone says Prish, I'm like, "Yeah, I get that." It has a strong classic FF cast. It has that global scope that you really want from a Final Fantasy game. It feels like a Final Fantasy in terms of narrative and themes and pacing. Like this is the one that feels like a mainline FF game. Out of all the expansions, this is the one that feels closest to like 4, 5, 6, 7. Like it has that pacing, that structure, that vibe, that tone. You kill the demiurge at the end of it. Like this is Final Fantasy through and through, and it's great. Like I don't really have criticisms of this one. Some people are like, "Oh, there were no new jobs, so it sucks." I'm just like, "All right, dude, sure, it sucks because there were no new jobs. Everything else about this is trash." But aside from those people who have opinions, I guess. Like pretty much everyone agrees, like no matter when you came into 11, if you're an old fan, if you're a new fan, like basically everybody who has actually played 11 agrees this is good, no matter when they came into the game. And that, I think, speaks to the quality of this content.
I completely agree. One thing that I think is massively overlooked in Chains of Promathia is the fact that it kind of varied up the gameplay loop. So for both the first expansion and the base game, there's kind of a basic structure to the gameplay loop where you go talk to an NPC, you either gather an item or talk to another NPC, but it's basically dialogue with exploration, with battle, dialogue, exploration, battle. Final Fantasy XI never leaves this basic gameplay loop behind. That having been said, it does start introducing some variety into it. So Chains of Promathia, I know a lot of people hate Paradamo Tor. That having been said, it was really bizarre to all of a sudden have a platformer in the middle of your RPG, and that's something that I personally enjoyed. It has you doing a lot of really, really wacky things, and this is where I personally just really enjoyed that gameplay loop. Absolutely nothing wrong with the base game or Rise of the Xylart, but, to have a platformer stuck in, to randomly go through the Prometheans and figure out the memory puzzles. I tried not to look at the guides for that, and the very first time I heard the Lufay's Metal music after spending hours and hours trying to figure out the memory receptacle stuff, that's, again, it's like one of those moments where you see the Promethean statue for the first time. Chains of Promathia just gives you so many things to do, and it genuinely feels like you're playing a game that isn't Final Fantasy XI anymore. It's like you're playing its own RPG. It's just, every other expansion afterward kind of followed that trend too, especially Wings of the Goddess, but that's something I absolutely loved about Chains of Promathia.
Yeah, I think the gameplay is really good. Paradamo Tor, I have mixed feelings on. We're just like, it is so absurd how specific that path is and how annoying it is, but also I respect what a good troll that is. So it's like, this is super like hard and just like hard just for the sake of being hard, but it's such a good troll. Like that is hilarious. So like I do respect it. So
oh man, talk about a troll though. I mean, what they did with that in Abyssia is really a troll. The fact that you fight a monster out there.
Shoot, we got to put Abyssia as number
Awful.
1 because of how good that troll was in Abyssia. I mean, that was really great. That was freaking hilarious. Like the freaking monster that's going to knock you off with the power of wind of Paradomotor. Like, I respect that. Like, they knew what they were doing with that, and it's hilarious. So full respect. But yeah, I agree. I am one of those guys who's glued to the guide with Final Fantasy 11. I enjoy guides with RPGs. I don't play all of them with guides, but 11 very much was a guide game for me. I'm just like, nope, I'm going to be like stuck to this the entire way through because of how esoteric this game is.
Yeah, there's absolutely no shame in that. Like, say, the game also just doesn't explain anything. Anytime I got to a zone and there was a bit of a puzzle, then I would try to avoid the guide, just to kind of figure out what the zone was trying to convey. But, I mean, there's sometimes it's just absolutely, like, say, Paradomotor, you have to look up the video guide for that. Otherwise, you're going to be spending hours upon hours upon hours trying to climb that mountain.
Yeah, no, it's very unintuitive. There's no way you're going to figure that out on your first try because it requires, like, falling in weird places that just, like, you wouldn't think to do. So, I mean, I respect it, but it's pretty absurd.
As far as story, like you said, it has the biggest cast of, like, solid static characters of any Final Fantasy game, and almost all of them have phenomenal arcs. So there's just so many good things to say about Chains of Promathia. It's a huge expansion, phenomenal expansion, and great story. That having been said, I don't think it's the best expansion, at least not for this conversation. One expansion...
Nope,
go ahead.
My number 1 ended up winning this expansion, so go ahead and announce it.
Wings of the Goddess. This is one expansion that, especially back when I started playing, I think I started playing in 2001 or something, it's, I guess, before some people came back and started talking about modern Final Fantasy XI, like Basic Guardian. I was told by so many people that this was a horrible expansion. The story was good, but then anytime someone would praise the story, they would complain about how it came out across 10 years or so. You know, how it took forever for the story to come out. This isn't as controversial as Abyssia, but how much Abyssia was disliked spilled over into Wings of the Goddess, at least in my experience when talking to some people. They say that this was genuinely the end of, like, the perfect 75 era stuff. If we're not counting any of the mini expansions and add-ons, I think it's hard to argue that Wings of the Goddess isn't the best expansion. Do you want to kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you, obviously you put Rhapsodies as number 1, so there's disagreement, but this is your number 2. So, like, my number 1, your number 2, this one, won the ranking, pretty definitively. Like, it didn't tie for first. It actually just straight up won. So, I think that a lot of people just, like, maybe forget what parts of 11's change were from Abyssia and what parts were from Wings of the Goddess, because they were separate releases. And the changes that people don't like were because of Abyssia, not because of Wings of the Goddess. So that is the first thing that needs to be established, is separating those things. Now, looking at Wings of the Goddess for what it is the best story content in the game, in my opinion, and it's not even really, like, much competition, to be honest, because, like, the main storyline of Wings of the Goddess and Lilithette and her arc is really good. Lady Lilith, possibly the best villain in FF11, easily in conversation for one of the best villains in Final Fantasy overall. Like, she's, like, with Kefka and Sephiroth and Arden, it's just, like, a great villain for the series. So you've got one of the best villains, you've got an incredible storyline, the time travel aspect of it really makes the base game and all the other expansions better, because you're getting so much added context for everything. Even with Autogon and them staying out of the conflict, you get some of that in Wings of the Goddess. You get to see those characters and what they were doing during the Crystal War. You get, backstory for Zaid. The backstory for Windurst is incredible. The backstory for Exenmel, like, why everyone thinks he's such a badass, because he was freaking 12 years old and was, like, one of the greatest fighters the nation had ever seen at age 12. So you get to see all this context, but you have these great individual story arcs, and it really captures, like, even just in terms of military tactics, like, the actual battle strategies are really smart and realistic. So that's impressive. But then there's, like, the tone, the emotions, the way people react to the war and the conflict. It's brilliant all around, and there's so much good character work, and there's so much good story. And the only, like, real complaints that I think are, somewhat valid is that it's long, and that the zones, like, you're not as interested in going to the zones because they're reworkings of zones from base 11. but the map layouts are different. So it's not just like, oh, it's the same things. Like, it's a different layout. It has some visual motifs of that map, but it's a new zone. You're going to be exploring different nooks and crannies. It's set up differently. Those are like the only two digs you can really levy at this thing. Like, or the rewards aren't super great, but like it's incredible. This is like one of the best Final Fantasy stories. So like, I guess if you're someone who's skipping the cutscenes, yeah, you might not realize that Wings of the Goddess is great. But if you're actually watching the cutscenes, you're like, oh, this is one of the best things the series has ever done.
That's one thing too, is this expansion has the most story content, like you said in your video. Almost all of the aspects of all of the stories are enjoyable too. There is some downtime between the stories, but the way downtime is written, the pacing of all of the stories, it's unbelievable that a single content can come out with 4 incredible stories, and the pacing in almost all 4 of them are incredibly well done. I've heard a lot of complaints about the Bastok story. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Like you were talking about, the espionage aspect of that particular storyline was really, really enjoyable for me. This is something.
And I like that there was like a murder mystery plot too in Final Fantasy. Like I love Sherlock Holmes. I love detective stories. So I love that. Like, oh, what if you did that in a Final Fantasy? Like that's pretty cool.
And the fact that you also get to see more of Zyde's character fleshed out, I think that was just the cherry on top for Bastok's story. Like I say, I do have some minor issues with it, but those issues are very minor when it comes to talking about issues that I have with Final Fantasy XI as a whole. I think Wings of the Goddess. Here's one thing, I'm not sure if you saw this when doing research for your video, but for the longest time, in Treasures of Ottergon, the devs kept promising content to players. And then it would get delayed because they said, well, we're actually putting that into the new expansion. We're shifting resources to the new expansion. When Wings of the Goddess came out, it had almost no content. That's one of the reasons that a lot of vets really dislike Wings of the Goddess. It's like, you ruined Treasures of Ottergon and then gave us a half-baked expansion. I can understand why some people still have some disdain for the way it launched, but in my humble opinion, if you're looking at modern Wings of the Goddess, almost every single complaint that I've seen for Wings of the Goddess, I don't necessarily see as valid, because a lot of those people haven't played through the entire expansion, whether that be not finishing the story or just not getting into what the modern experience of the expansion is like, you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's, it's like the folks who complain. If you said, the Voracious Resurgence is trash, but you only played like the first couple missions when like it first came out, like, okay, but the rest of it is out now, and it's been out for, in the case of Wings of the Goddess, like a decade at this point. If you're gonna go and actually play through it, it's incredible. So like, okay, yeah, it needed more at launch, fine, but its launch has happened. We've gotten through it. So no, I think Wings of the Goddess is, if you're actually playing through it, like if you're putting all of this side by side in comparison, how it is like present day, it's in my opinion, it's easily the best of 11. But I think Chains is fair competition for it. I think Chains, does have better zones in terms of like the creativity of the zones. Like there's nothing in Wings of the Goddess as cool as the coolest zones in Chains of Promathia. Top tier for the series, period. But in terms of narrative quality, this is like some of the best stuff they've ever done in Final Fantasy. And so if you value story, which I know a lot of 11 players just don't. So I get it. Like if you're skipping the cutscenes, you're just like, whatever, these zones are boring and I'm not getting any good gear, so why am I playing this? Like, all right. But if you're playing an RPG for like story content and emotional narrative, and like the gameplay loop is fun. Like some of the mini games are fun to do, and that there's freaking one. I'm trying to remember what the mission was, but like the one where you were like running through this cave and you had to set off the explosives, and you could not mess up once. I freaking hated that, but it was so memorable going through that a million times. Like you couldn't just grind out of that. You just had to get good, son. I don't know. It was really creative. The stories were incredible, and yeah, the emotional payoff was so great.
Yeah, I completely agree. As far as gameplay too, it did everything that Chains of Promathia did as far as varying the gameplay loop, but bigger and better. Kind of like you were talking about, there's a mini game where you have to set off explosives. That was both infuriating and probably some of the most fun gameplay I did in all of 11, because it was so different from anything else the story has you doing. I know some people kind of get irritated when it comes to that stuff, but I mean, that's one topic. 11 has a lot of mini games that it introduces throughout the story, and for me, I enjoyed a lot of those. Yeah, Wings of the Goddess, just as a whole, it's really, at least in my opinion, for standalone expansions, not mini expansions or add-ons, Wings of the Goddess is undeniably the best expansion in Final Fantasy XI.
I mean, it only ranked number 2 to Rhapsodies for you, which, again, the semantics of like what is an expansion and what isn't, I think it's silly minutia. Like, the debates among that. Like, I don't count Dynamis because it was clearly, part of Rise of the Xylart. If it comes paired with something else, that thing that it's paired with is the expansion, is the main thing. Like, I'm not going to call Sword an expansion because it came with Voracious. So, that's how I view it. And then people are just like, no, Rhapsodies doesn't count, and Voracious doesn't count, and Abyssia doesn't count. But also, they've told me Seekers doesn't count, too. So,
yeah.
But that's just because I don't like it. That's why Seekers doesn't count.
Yeah, to me, and perhaps it's because I view 11 as just one giant game, but like you said, the semantics around what constitutes an add-on versus mini expansion versus full expansion, and how naming each of these different things validates its content for the game, I think it's a really, really ridiculous conversation. Because at the end of the day, if you play through all of 11's content, you're going to have the same experience as anyone else who uses different terminology, Speaking of rankings, has your opinion on Final Fantasy XI changed? Because I know overall in your series you ranked it relatively low. Would you keep it at that same spot, or would you raise that up now that you've gotten through a lot more of the content?
Well, the thing is, when I did those rankings, I had already beaten all this content.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I ranked it low based upon the base game in those categories because I knew I hadn't beaten the rest of 14, and I wanted to give them the same handicap. Because I beat a Realm Reborn, and so I was ranking most of those categories based on base 11 and base 14. That was the way that felt the most fair to approach it. And to, not give 11 the advantage of like 20 years of content versus like Final Fantasy 1 having just like the game. Yeah. But I do acknowledge, like in my overall ranking video, where like I ranked base 11 low, but then at the end of the Final Fantasy 8 segment I said, by the way, if I ranked all of 11, it would rank above Final Fantasy 8. So like I did put like the asterisks there, and there are other categories where I acknowledge like the entirety of content for the game, and then like 11 usually in those videos ranked like number 2 or number 1. I rank it very highly personally as like an entire experience. As far as Final Fantasy games that beat it for me, it'd be 7, 4, 9, Tactics, and then it's like neck and neck with 10. And I think 10 edges it out very slightly, just because I think like the entire Tidus Yuna love story is really, really strong. I think the entire thing with the commentary on religion and the corrupting power of it is really strong. Like the sin thing and Jet, like I think I like 11, maybe like a little bit more than 10, but I think 10 is slightly higher quality. But those two are like neck and neck in the same way that like Chrono Trigger and Xenogears are neck and neck for me. And it's like, it's really tough for me to place them. But like 11 is top shelf Final Fantasy. Like it's in the top category alongside 7, 4, 9, Tactics, and 10 for me. Like so that and 11, those are like my top favorites. And then you have to go a step down to the next level of games, which I still love, but like, in terms of the top shelf, 11 is there.
I did have one last question now that we've finished all of this. You ranked a lot of the Final Fantasy games. Where does 16 fall on your overall ranking?
So 16, I've only seen the story from it, so I haven't played. I don't have a PS5, just not on the cards right now. Story-wise, I would rank it pretty high. I think it's very good. I think it's the best Cid in the series, and I didn't think that would be possible. To top like 7 Cid or 4 Cid, but he did. It is the best Cid. I think Clive is a great character. I think the music is better than 14's, and I haven't played all of 14 yet. I'm gonna finish it after I finish the rest of Another Eden, because Another Eden, because it's a free live service game, I'm more worried about that one going offline than Final Fantasy 14. And I know Another Eden is really popular, and it seems like it's not slowing down, but FOMO. Playing Another Eden before the rest of 14, so 16 story-wise, I think impressed me, and I don't understand why people hate it so much. I'm guessing it might be like the gameplay loop maybe isn't super satisfying, but in terms of narrative, it's good.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear it. Man, we wound up talking a lot longer than just an hour. But I really
I
enjoyed
knew
this
that would be what would
conversation.
happen.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal conversation. I really enjoyed hearing a little bit more elaborated thoughts from you as far as some of these expansions. So I really appreciate you coming on here and doing this with me.
And I appreciate you having me on. It is an honor, like I said, before we started recording, which I don't know how much of the pre-intro talk will be in the video, but, I found you as a fan of your videos. You found me as a fan of my videos. We found each other completely independent, and it's nice that, two people who appreciate each other's work could chat about the game, and you could get, this is an interesting perspective. Two new fans to 11 talking about it, not just like dudes who just like, oh man, remember Autogon in 2006? Yeah, man, so good.
I completely agree. It's really, really nice to be talking to someone without a lot of the, I guess, the rose-tinted glasses for classic 11 and disdain for newer 11. That's one thing that I really dislike, is even a lot of people who want to talk about 11, they talk almost exclusively about classic 11 or private server 11. There's very little conversation about, say, Seekers of Adulan and Forward, some of the most phenomenal content for 11 out there. And it's really, really phenomenal to be able to talk to someone who cares about the same exact game, the way the game is nowadays, as I do. So thank you again so much for being on here. I really, really enjoyed this. And who knows, at some point, perhaps after you finish 14 content, and after I finish the 14, my 14 series at some point in the future, we can get back on here and talk about 14.
Yeah, we'll talk about 14 in like 2 years and then be like, oh man, still not as good as 11. We'll be rose-tinted glasses in that way.
That's funny. I'm excited for 14. I'm sure I'm really going to like it. As much as I like 11, I have a hard time seeing it top that, though. So we'll see what that conversation is like in 2 years, man.
Yeah, we will see in 2 years.